achievement work session. We only have our student achievement work session scheduled tonight. And before we begin, I just want to share some opening remarks. Just to recap, earlier in this school year, early fall, we, this Board of Education with the superintendent, committed to 3 goals. As a result of those 3 goals, we committed to progress monitoring them at the beginning of the year, middle of the year, and end of the year. We are fulfilling this commitment. We have not strayed in any way from this. Just as a refresher, in November at our board meeting, business meeting, we did a very in-depth review of our beginning of the year DIBELS or literacy testing and math test, iReady math test results. In December, we had an in-depth presentation from staff on the 2023 state test results, which were disaggregated by English language learners, students with disabilities, race, and grade level. And just this past February, in our business meeting, we had an in-depth presentation on last year's graduation cohort. Today, in this work session, we are getting middle of the year test results from the DIBELS and the iReady math. And then by June, we will have a presentation and discussion on the end of the year results of those assessments. Just want to also remind the public that the district has a data dashboard on its website that includes state assessment results and attendance and suspension data that is essentially updated in real time. So I want to make it very clear, in my opinion as a board member, what we are doing as a board with Dr. Williams is far from the status quo. And I said it in November, find me another local school district that is publicly sharing and discussing data and doing so in such an in-depth manner. Before I transition to Dr. Williams and Mrs. Botticelli to kick off the presentation, I'm going to just let President Belton-Cottman share some opening remarks. Is she still with us?
Not hear you, Larry.
She can't hear me though.
Can you hear him, Dr. Williams? No?
I can. Can you hear me?
I can't hear anyone. Okay.
Okay.
Shoot.
All right, do you want to just transition to Dr.?
I think we can transition now to Chief Botticelli, and then we can come back to.
All right. President Belton-Cottman, I know you can't hear us, but we are going to come back to you when you get your technology fixed. Hello. And I'm going to turn it over to Superintendent Dr. Williams to kick things off.
Okay. Thank you so much, Chairman Scott. You know, whenever board president is able to engage in the conversation, I will stop and allow her to have some time to say a few words. You know, I too feel like, you know, as the superintendent of the school district, it's a role and responsibility. It's a role and responsibility that I take seriously. And, you know, I say all of the time that for me, this is not business as usual. I've been around Buffalo schools almost my entire life. I have family members myself that are children in this district. And so I've always taken seriously the responsibility of keeping our public informed about where we are. I don't shy away and I don't hide from our data. I think, in fact, the only way that we continue to move upward is to interrupt some things that may have been hidden and to confront those things. And so I've been very, you know, very honest about that. In addition to the dashboard that you mentioned, you know, we all of the time, several times a week, share information with our media. We did a state of the schools address. We post our data. Sometimes when we post our data, it causes more questioning than it would if we did not. We do a lot to get the data out there. We want to keep our parents informed. We want to keep our partners informed. We want to keep all of our community leaders informed. It's important. And so, I'm excited about tonight since we embarked upon this partnership with the Council of Great City Schools. Virtually all of our meetings have been data-informed meetings, whether they are community meetings or boards of education meetings, and these are publicly accessible to the community. So in no way, shape, or form do we, ever desire to appear that we are secretly hiding data. In fact, our students are doing
I can
better.
hear now. Okay, thanks.
Perfect.
Bye-bye.
Doing better in a lot of areas. And so we're excited. We want to get the word out and let our teachers and our principals and our parents and community know that our children are doing much better. In fact, when I looked at the 37 elementary schools that we have in the district, close to half of those schools have already, at this mid-year point, gotten their children on this DIBELS data to benchmark level. I don't know that that has ever happened. And so to have that happen to this particular group, which you're going to hear from Ms. Botticelli, is that this is a group of students who are in third grade that are particularly challenged because they were in pre-K when the pandemic hit and they were sent home that March. And so for half a year that year, the next year it was hybrid and remote and all of this. The following year when they came back, it was with restrictions. Teachers were wearing masks. They couldn't look at their lips, as they were learning phonics. So this is a group of children that have had challenges. And, I know that I'm a storyteller. I like to share the story because I think if we don't put some context to the data, then the data really is meaningless and it's easy to just misinterpret. And so I have to be able to share why we got to the point we're in, because it's going to inform how we move forward. Our children, this data have faces. It's not just numbers. These are faces. These are children. These are real lives. And so I think it helps us to increase understanding. It helps to have richer insights. And so tonight you're going to hear a little background on who this third grade population is, where we are. We have nothing to be ashamed of at all. Our children are performing. Our teachers are teaching. We have a long ways to go, but we are making strides. So I will get off my soapbox. I will turn things over to the president. And thank you for listening.
Well, sorry about the technical difficulties. I just wanted to say, and maybe that this weekend our stock went up. The Buffalo News did an article about us, and I'm adamant about making sure that when things are out there about this school district that we respond, and we respond in a positive light, but when they go low, we go high. And I want to be clear that there was no reason that this data had to be released last week, none whatsoever. It had been given to the board minutes before the board meeting started. I had not even had a chance to review it, nor had many of the board members. And when I spoke to the superintendent, we talked about when we would do it, we could pull it together. Originally, this data was supposed to be disclosed next month in April. It was supposed to be released. However, and I need to make this clear, the only reason that we're going into this report today rather than in April, based on our calendar, is because Dr. Williams and soon to be Dr. Ann Betticelli will not be available during that time that we normally would do this. Other than that, this data would have remained confidential or hidden, as some people wanted to say, until such time. Note that no one is sharing data of this magnitude but us. It is available if the news or someone wants to foil it from other school districts, but you won't see that happen. And so in moving forward, I want to thank the community that reached out to me that said that they had confidence, and I received several calls from ministers, from community leaders, that they had confidence in me if I requested that the data be held, that They did not think that it was going to not be given to the community and that the district was not doing their proper duties. Our job as board members are to protect parents to serve and children, to serve them and to make sure that our children are always seen in the best positive light. And I feel that we're doing that under this administration, and today's data will reflect that. And I want to make sure that in moving forward, that we understand that it is not about a checklist. It is about what's best for our children. And had that information went out last week without context, it would have made everything really, really just wrong, just crazy. So we're not going to be allowing our children to be painted in a picture other than what they deserved. And I appreciate the board members that allow such things to happen. So thank you, board and everyone. But I wanted to put that out there because it is time out for Buffalo Public Schools being smeared all over the newspaper in order to justify, I guess, increased sales, because there was nothing of substance in that article other than that. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Botticelli, are you ready?
I'm all set.
Okay, you can begin.
Good evening. I'm actually really excited to be here because I think we've got a great story to tell tonight. I'm going to share our DIBELS data, K-4, and our iReady data, also K-4, but focus on math. So this is our middle of year update. Admir, can you please change the slide? So as always, we are moving to the next level with one voice, one vision, and one mission. I'm going to focus today on rigorous early elementary education. Next slide, please.
Excuse me. Can everybody on the meeting please mute? Go ahead.
Thank you. In terms of our 5x5 goals, we always strive to eliminate achievement and opportunity gaps and give access to educational excellence and accelerated learning to our students. So goals number 1 and 2 are our focus tonight. Next slide, please. So the superintendent has also set very specific targets for us to meet in reading, mathematics, and graduation rate. Tonight we're going to be focused on the mathematics rate. We want our students by the end of year, so right now we're in the middle, we want them by the end of year to hit 15.9% of proficiency. So in terms of iReady scores, that would be early, middle, or on grade level targets. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick snapshot of some data from a report that was released recently from the Western New York Education Alliance. I wanted to sort of frame some of the work that we're doing. So we've had a huge push for the science of reading in this district for several years, and I believe that we are starting to see the benefits of this push. So when the Western New York Education Alliance adjusted for income, so for difference in income, in terms of the performance rates of different districts, you'll see that Buffalo, for grades 3 to 5 data, actually came out 7th out of 28 districts. That is huge. So research will say that 60 to 70% of divergence between proficiency scores across districts is driven by income. And as you know, we have a very high rate of poverty in this particular district. So BPS is actually also, according to this study, the second best performing large school district in Erie County as measured by student growth and ELA proficiency scores. So even though our scores may not seem as high as some of the other districts, when controls are put in place, our students are outperforming students across the county. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to take you into some of the ABCs of our DIBELS data. Next slide, please. To keep things in perspective, I know you've seen this slide before, but this is the pandemic context for interpreting our scores. So if you look far to the left, in pink, you can see our current grade 3 students were in pre-K in 2019-20 when we went out for the pandemic. So they were in pre-K up until March, and then after that, they were sent home. They did not necessarily have access to traditional instruction. They may have received some packets and hopefully were able to communicate with their teacher. When they came back the next year, they were remote, and at one point went hybrid. Some select students were in person, but this was their kindergarten year. So I think everybody's heard me say before, kindergarten and first grade are the foundation for literacy skills. This is when you develop phonemic awareness and phonics understanding. So if you were a student in our current third graders in kindergarten at this time, you had a very different type of exposure to phonemic awareness and phonics skills. You heard the superintendent reference masks. So even when the students were back, their teacher had to wear a mask. They had to wear masks. That makes it physically impossible to see the way that students are forming sounds when they're practicing their skills. So there were a lot of things going on. They had social distancing, which made it even more difficult to do teacher-led small group instruction. So across several years, this particular group of students was dramatically affected by the pandemic, more so than other grade levels, because they did not have that normal introduction to phonemic awareness and phonics in kindergarten that a student would typically have. You'll also see that our fourth graders were impacted by this because they went out in the middle of kindergarten. So they had several months of traditional instruction, but again, missed that remaining portion of kindergarten. Next slide, please. This is from a study that Amplify put out a couple years ago. So if you see that arrow pointing to the bar that says 47%, those are our current third graders back when they were in kindergarten. So the DIBELS data at this time that MClass is sharing indicated that 47% of the kids across the nation who were administered DIBELS at this time were in need of intensive intervention. So not just intervention, like we might deliver an RTI, but intensive intervention. The year before, only 28% of kindergartners were in need of intensive intervention across the nation. So you can see what a dramatic gap that is from the year before COVID to the year of COVID, excuse me, the year after COVID in 2021. So again, this is the group of students that we are targeting with the superintendent's goals. So in kindergarten, they were already significantly far behind the cohort the year before at that point in time, in the middle of the year. Next slide, please. You've also seen this one before, but I always like to give a quick refresher on what DIBELS 8 is and what its purpose is, so that everyone who's watching is on the same page. So DIBELS 8 is a universal screening measure. Universal meaning all students take it, K to 4. And screening measure in that it indicates risk levels. So it gives us sort of a red flag if a particular student is at risk of not meeting proficiency by the end of the grade level. So if you look across the bottom, you'll see BoI, PM, PM standing for progress monitoring. So beginning of year, several progress monitorings in between before the middle of year, several more progress monitorings are administered, and then we have the end of year assessment. So all of those tests are leveled in that they are all the same amount, they're the same level of difficulty. So a student at the beginning of year might be assessed, for example, in kindergarten on the short E sound, even though they have not been taught that yet, right? They actually aren't taught that till a little bit after the middle of year assessment, but they'll be assessed on that particular skill. Because again, this is looking for risk. The only thing that changes, so the difficulty of the test remains the same, but the cut score increases. So at the beginning of the year, a student could be considered proficient by meeting a very low standard, and then that cut score gets more and more, or it goes up, or it gets more difficult by the end of the year. So even though the level of difficulty of the test remains the same, the point that the students have to meet to be deemed proficient increases with each administration. Next slide, please. So here's our kindergarten data. At the top, you'll see beginning, middle, and end of last year, so 22, 23. And then right beneath that, you'll see beginning and middle of this current school year, 23, 24. So you can see I circled a couple things. I circled the middle of year from last year and the middle of year from this year for intensive level. So you can see we went down 5% from middle of last year to middle of this year, meaning the intervention that we are providing is making a difference. So we went down 5% from where we were last year. So when it's red, you want to see the numbers decrease, the percents decrease, and then you want to see the green and the blue percentages rise. So we're very pleased that from middle of last year to middle of this year, we've gone down 5% in terms of intensive level. If you move over to the right and the green and blue bars, you can see from the middle of last year to the middle of this year, we went up 5%. So we went down in terms of the percentage of students who were intensive level, and we went up 5% in terms of the students who were proficient or above. If you also look at at the beginning of year and this year's middle of year, we went up 9% in kindergarten. So from beginning to middle of this year, our kindergartners increased 9% in terms of proficiency. So not only are they down in terms of intensive from previous years at this time, but right now from beginning to middle of the year, we're up 9% in terms of proficiency. If you look at the two bars at the bottom, you can see our economically disadvantaged population. We're comparing beginning to middle of this year. We actually went down 10% in terms of intensive level students. So we went from 57% to 47% intensive, meaning we're moving in the right direction. That's a significant decrease in the number of students that are performing at intensive levels, meaning that they need significant intervention. On the converse, we went up 9% in terms of proficiency. So 10% decrease in the percent of students scoring at the intensive level, 9% increase in the percent of students scoring at the benchmark or above level. So this is this year's kindergarten data. And I do provide this for context as we move through the grade levels. We administer DIBELS K to 4. Next slide, please. So here's our first grade composite data. And again, I circled to the left. Last year's middle of year percentage was 53. This year is 51 for the intensive level. So we went down 2% from this point in time last year in terms of the percent of students scoring at the intensive level. Conversely, from middle of last year to middle of this year, we went up 3% in terms of students performing at the proficient level. If you look at the beginning of year to the middle of year this year, we're up 6% in terms of proficiency. And we're down 3% in terms of intensive level. If you only look at the economically disadvantaged population, the two bars at the bottom, from beginning to middle of this year, we're down 4% in terms of the intensive level, and we're up 6% proficiency. So again, we're making gains and then also decreasing the intensive percentage at the same time. Next slide, please. So again, comparing middle of year last year to middle of year this year, our second grade cohort is down 10% in terms of the percentage of students at the intensive level. So we've had a really intense focus on intervention, especially at Tier 3, which is the group of students that you're looking at in red. They're down 10% from where that for the other cohort was last year. We have not shown significant gains this year from beginning to middle. But from middle of last year to middle of this year, our students are up 6% in proficiency. If you only compare economically disadvantaged students from the beginning to middle of this year, again, 4% decrease in terms of the intensive population and a 1% increase in terms of proficiency. And you're going to note, I have a little footnote at the bottom. So our student count fluctuates throughout the school year. So you might notice comparing if we pulled it in the beginning of the year or beginning of the school data, if we pulled it now, the numbers might vary a bit because as students transfer into the district, they're often administered that particular assessment, so the numbers will fluctuate. We also have students leaving. Next slide, please. So here's our target demographic. You can see from the middle of last year to the middle of this year, the percentage of students at the intensive level has gone down 5%. So again, you know that we are targeting Tier 3 instruction. If you only look at economically disadvantaged, it's gone down 1%. And then if you look at proficiency for our economically disadvantaged students, it's gone up 1%. And from middle of last year to middle of this year, there's been a 3% increase in proficiency. So third grade is not where we want it to be yet, but I do want to remind you of the conversation we had at the beginning. This is the demographic, this is the group that was impacted the most heavily by COVID. So we are really doing a lot of work with this particular cohort of students, and we feel very strongly that we're going to make gains by the end of the year. Next slide, please. So for our grade 4 students, we actually went up a little bit in terms of intensive level from middle of last year to middle of this year. And we went down a little bit proficiency-wise from middle to middle. However, if you're only looking at the economically disadvantaged students from the beginning of this year to the middle of this year, they actually improved by 4%. As did the overall cohort, improved by 4% proficiency. Next slide, please. So here's the comparison of our beginning to middle year data for our special education population and our English language learners. So from beginning to middle of this year, the cohort numbers varied a little bit, but the percentage remained the same. And I am rounding just up or down depending, but 16%. And then in terms of our L population, it went from 21 to 23% proficiency. So overall in this cohort, economically disadvantaged third graders, there are 1,692 students with test scores. 571 of those were proficient, about 34%. Next slide, please. When we look at some other subgroups, you can see that our Asian population improved by about 2%. Our Black and African American population scores improved by about 2%. Next slide, please. Our multiracial population, the percentage of proficiency decreased by 2%, but you can also see how small that cohort is. So any fluctuation there dramatically affects the percentage. And then for our white population, it also went down by about 1%. Next slide, please. Oh, you skipped one. Can you go back one more? Thank you. Our Hispanic student population proficiency rate improved by about 1%. Again, the cohort numbers changed a little bit. Next slide, please. So we have a reading action plan. We've been working on a number of things throughout the year, but we've been very targeted the past month or so. So in terms of professional development, you know that we've been focused on our cores, I should say the most important trainings. So letters training, language essentials for teachers of reading and spelling, step up to writing, Orton-Gillingham, and morphology training. Excuse me. So those have been our big push for the elementary especially, but some of these are across grade levels, because we know that we need to have a science of reading core group of teachers that understand that principle. So letters gives them the foundation to understand what we're asking them to do when they intervene using Orton-Gillingham or morphology. So we put our K-4 teachers through letters training to develop that understanding of the science of reading, and then we provide them with strategies to use to intervene with our students. In terms of curriculum, we actually have adopted a new reading series for grades 3 to 6. So there's always an implementation dip when you first adopt. So I'm actually pleased that we did not see a dip in our scores at this point. We are providing training for use of the reading series, but we also continue to train teachers in the interventions that they need to support those students who started at a disadvantage because of COVID. You know that we also have programs like Lexia, Junior Great Books. We use Step Up to Writing to support writing instruction. We have Orton-Gillingham for basic phonics, and morphology is more of an advanced phonics intervention. And then we provide data-driven instruction. So our teachers analyze their data regularly to make instructional decisions in the classroom. So we follow the response to intervention program. Our students walk to the appropriate teacher to receive intervention at their level. And we really target, especially at third grade, we are really targeting Tier 3 students who require that phonics intervention. But working with Dr. Williams, we've also put a new plan into place where we will be targeting particular students that are sort of on the cusp of proficiency. So we're really looking to schools to identify a cohort of students that they know they can move into proficiency with the right amount of support and the correct amount of intervention. So we're going to be really targeted with schools. We met with all the principals last month for reading. We actually did it again this month for mathematics. We outlined for them exactly what needs to happen at the building level and asked them to create a plan to implement. So they are all working to develop their specific plans, and especially with targets for particular students, so that we can move the needle on our DIBEL scores and our iReady scores. But nothing gets done if it's not monitored. So we also continue to use the coaching tool. We have ongoing progress monitoring for DIBEL, so teachers have their finger on the pulse of where students are performing in terms of reading. We visit schools on a regular basis. So I will walk with the Associate for School Leadership of a particular school. The principal will join us, other administrators, we will walk through classrooms, share feedback, make action plans. The ASLs are wonderful about following up after those visits to make sure that everything that needs to be put into place is being put into place. We have, again, the targeted support plan. The central office staff goes out to support. Our Department of Reading is constantly out. We have coaches in the buildings that will provide support. We have ELT programs where kids can get extra time with teachers. So we're doing as much as we can to support the implementation plans that are being put into place at the school level. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about our math scores. Next slide, please. Just as a refresher, iReady is a diagnostic tool. So we use it grades, I'm going to talk today about K to 4. So the student will log into the system and the system will adjust based on how proficient the student is answering questions. So questions might get more difficult or they might become easier depending on how the student is performing, because the system wants to diagnose exactly what interventions are required to support that particular student. So it's adaptive in the sense that the questions can get more difficult or less difficult based on how the student is currently performing. So in the beginning of the year, it's very reasonable to expect that kids might not perform very well because they haven't been exposed to all the skills they're being assessed on. Next slide, please. So this is some data from the NAEP. So in 2022, the NAEP was administered across the nation. The map you're looking at is based on the TUDA districts, so the Trial Urban District Association, TUDA. Those districts volunteered to be part of a cohort of urban districts that take the NAEP, and the data is used to improve instruction. So findings from the 2022 NAEP showed that in 2022, the average 4th grade math score decreased by 5 points. So this average across the nation, and was lower than all previous assessment years going back to 2005. So the 2022 data showed that our 4th graders were in significant need of intervention in terms of mathematics. So that really applies to all students who are affected by COVID and by schools going out for a time and then coming back, and just the way we had to implement things. So nationally, in 2022, 4th grade math scores decreased by 5 points. The average score for the large city schools declined by 8 points compared to the previous administration in 2019. So when you look at this map, you're seeing that 23 of the districts listed here actually had decreasing proficiency rates. Only 3 had no significant change and none increased. So Buffalo is certainly not alone in dealing with the effects of COVID and how math instruction needs to change in the next few years and be very targeted to support students. Next slide, please. So here's our kindergarten data. At the top, you can see last year's beginning to middle, just as a reference point for you. And then the bottom shows you the beginning to middle of this year. The first 2 there are the overall scores, including all students. And then the bottom 2 scores for beginning and middle are the economically disadvantaged population. So you can see that in terms of beginning to middle, for the economically disadvantaged kindergartners, they improved proficiency rates by 18%. If you look to the right, you see that I noted these are matched scores. So you're only looking, that 1440 only represents kids that had a beginning and a middle for comparison purposes. So it's not every single student that might have taken the test, it's only students that had 2 scores. These are the kids that we had the opportunity to actually instruct for a significant enough amount of time that we could see if our instruction was working. So that's why I highlighted this for you here. So those 1440 improved by 18% from where they started the year in kindergarten. Next slide, please. In grade 1, the economically disadvantaged students improved the proficiency rate by 8%. And I think this is important. Decreased the intensive level by 18%. So the red represents students who are below level 1 or more years. So that population decreased by 18%, while the proficiency rate went up by 8%. Next slide, please. And your next slide, please. So this is grade 2. In terms of economically disadvantaged students, the percent proficiency rate increased by 6%, and the percent below level decreased by 20%. Next slide, thank you. So in terms of grade 3, the proficiency rate improved by 9% for our economically disadvantaged students, and decreased by 18% for students below grade level. So again, the grade 3 students, economically disadvantaged only, improved by 9%, and the rate of students at the intensive level decreased by 18%. So I know you don't have a growth target set for the superintendent, but I think it's important to point out that students have to move through the levels to proficiency. So it's seldom that a student will jump from being significantly far behind to being benchmark. So I just want you to see that students are moving into the next level as they progress through the year. For grade 4, the economically disadvantaged population proficiency rate improved by 6%, and the intensive level decreased by 11%. Next slide, please. So from beginning to middle of year, students with disabilities improved by 5% proficiency. And our L population increased proficiency by 5% as well. So the total cohort here with a score was 1,668. Of those, 163 were proficient, which is approximately 10%. Next slide, please. So our Asian population increased proficiency by 16%. Our Black and African American population increased proficiency by 6%. Next slide, please. Our multiracial population, again, which is a very small cohort, improved by 10%. And our white student population increased proficiency by 14%. Next slide, please. The Hispanic population improved proficiency by 4%. Demographically speaking, across the nation, Hispanic and Black students were hit the hardest in terms of proficiency rates during the COVID. So on our various assessments, we definitely want to keep our eye on those particular populations, and schools are very aware. We actually practiced filtering the data by these subgroups so that they can stay on top of their students and make sure that they are targeting kids that need the most intervention. Next slide, please. So we have a similar action plan for mathematics. You've heard me talk about our GATES cohort. So our 6th grade teachers have been invited to participate in the GATES effective implementation cohort. They meet on Saturdays and get very intensive instruction in content knowledge. And then we've also been offering numbers training, grades K to 5, to make sure that our teachers have that basic understanding of how to deliver math appropriately. In terms of curriculum and resources, we use the modules, but we also have First in Math, which targets fluency. Zern supports module instruction. And we have MobiMax, which diagnoses student need and then assigns activities based on that particular need. Again, we are targeting students who are on that bubble that we know we can move to proficiency. So we're really going to be working with the schools to get lists of students and then check in regularly to see how those students are progressing. We have been talking to schools about a more structured RTI approach for mathematics. So similar to reading, we're hoping that many schools will move to a walk-to model for math so that they walk to the appropriate level of intervention during RTI. We also have a coaching tool designed specifically for mathematics, and we can run usage reports on different interventions to see how well and how frequently they're being used and whether it's making a difference. So for example, I can run a First in Math report to see how many students have been logging in, what they're doing, how it's working. We also provide a lot of incentives. So students, they get recognized as being the student of the week or the class of the week or the school of the week for First in Math. So those go out weekly in our weekly bulletin and they're shared across buildings. If you walk into some schools, you'll see certificates on the wall that they were a school of the week or a class of the week. Walk into West Hurl, the first thing you see down the pillar are all her certificates week after week for being one of the top schools. Recently, School 17 had the top 2nd grader in the district, and I know that they were extremely excited about that. But we try to not only monitor, but also encourage. We want to have incentives for our students, making sure that they understand why these things are important, why does fluency matter, how will that impact their scores, and how will that impact their understanding of mathematics, but also trying to make it fun for them. So again, we've had very concentrated central office participation. So our assistant superintendent, Kelly Baudo, will go out with the math team and they'll go to a particular school. They'll walk the math classrooms with the administration from the building. They'll provide feedback. They use the coaching tool. They really look at the 3rd grade data in particular to determine where they need to make tweaks instructionally in the classrooms. I continue to go out with the ASLs. We walk with administration as well. We look at usage reports. So it's one of the first things I like to do with schools is just check in to see, are they using the systems that we've put in place? And again, we just did a training yesterday with the elementary administrators targeting mathematics for the 2nd semester, talking about what things could look like and what they need to do to implement. So I am happy to take any questions. I know that's a lot of data. I tried to go a little more quickly than last time.
Thank you, Chief Botticelli. Board members, questions. I will start with Board Member Woods. Do you have any questions? You are good.
No questions.
No questions. All right. Board Member Rivera, Dr. Rivera, any questions?
I don't have any questions. I do want to highlight a few things that I really appreciate the way that you presented the data, and that it's clear where we stand, but also with the forward-thinking way about the way that you're presenting this, which is, this is what we've done, this is where we're at, this is what we're going to do next. And I think that's the biggest thing. It's not so much about the data, as Dr. Williams said, these are students. These are our students. And we need to know how they're doing and what we can do next for them. So I look forward to being more about that conversation, being a part of it. And just as a personal thank you, as an English person, thank you for doing the science of reading. I think it's really clear it's working.
Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Rivera. Board Member McEachen, any questions?
Thank you also for a comprehensive presentation. I do just have Just have one question related to the goals, because we know earlier in the slides we talked about the first or the 3 goals that we have, and the one that you were presenting on are goal 1 and goal 2. And so I guess my question, and it goes for both of them. So we are looking at, or our goal for this year was to see the iReady hit, I believe it was 15.9% was kind of that year end in June. Do you think that, given the numbers that you were able to present today for that 3rd grade class specifically, because that's what we wrote the goal for, being at 10%, do you think we're on target for this to be achievable? I know that there's all sorts of strategies we put in there, so that I would love hearing all of that. But I'm just kind of wondering, given the data, and this is not something I'm super familiar with, do you think that it looks like we may be able to move it closer to that number before the close of the year?
So I'll
we've
start.
never looked at- Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
And if you want to follow up, you know, I'm very optimistic, and I know how hard everyone is working, but I don't want to overpromise and say we can absolutely meet that goal. For me, more than meeting the goal, it's about showing the progress and showing the work that we're doing. We knew that this would be a tough group, and the 3rd graders, and then within that tough group, we chose to focus on children who have been deemed as economically disadvantaged, which we knew that would make it a little bit harder, but we knew that if that group of children got what they needed, then, you know, everybody else would get what they needed also. So I think, you know, the most important thing for me is that we're showing progress. I do believe that we can meet the goal. You know, Ann and her team and Dr. Moret, you know, everybody is really focused on these 3 goals. So I'm very optimistic that we can. I know all of our building principals are too, and the coaches and reading and math teachers. We're going to do everything that we can. You've heard a litany of supports that, you know, we're providing to help to make sure that we can. We're even, you know, involving our parents. There was just an article done in the Investigative Post about how, you know, working with our adult education learners, you know, because many of them have children who are in our schools, and by increasing their literacy rates and mathematic rates, we believe that, you know, that will also help. So we're really trying not to leave any stone unturned.
So there's not much more I can say. I concur. It is a stretch goal, not gonna lie. But I am optimistic that we will at least come very close to that particular goal. We've never looked at it in terms of socioeconomically disadvantaged students before. We had always looked at the whole when we were talking about setting targets. So this is a different lens that we're using. But you can see, I mean, it's not that discrepant. So if you look at our overall rate for 3rd grade, they're at 14%. The economically disadvantaged students are at 10%. So it's not outrageous. It's not an outrageous gap. So I do think there's the definite possibility that we will come very close or hit the mark.
Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member McEachen. Board Member Hurd, any questions?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. And thank you, Mrs. Benicelli. Well, I'm going to say Dr. Benicelli for all the work that you're doing and putting such together a great PowerPoint to show how much the district is progressing, and how, you know, through hard work and through programs and work with this administrative staffs, you know, I mean, I'm just elated because you're saying that the teachers, you know, being trained in a reading program. They also mentioned that we met with the principals, and the ASLs is walking through the schools, and that's very, very important. We're looking at structure and look at the competency of our teachers, you know, and seeing that this is a measure, you know, that this district is taken seriously. So thank you for your work with that. I do have a question though. My question is based upon our ELL students. It was a rise in our ELL students, but we have more students coming in, you know, monthly and weekly. And how are they tested with ELL?
In terms of iReady and Dibbles?
Yes, because there's many different languages that's spoken, with 85 different languages here.
Right.
I mean, how can we actually get like a composite test, or how are they tested, you know, with Dibbles?
I hear you. It's very difficult to know, especially for mathematics, if a language barrier is impacting their results. The iReady only comes in Spanish and English, so we wouldn't be able to administer it in other languages. So there's definitely the possibility that a student's home language may be impacting their understanding of some of the questions in the mathematics assessment. In terms of the DIBELS assessment, we test all students in English. We don't allow any accommodations for that in terms of language, because we're checking to see if they understand English. So you are correct. There are hundreds of students coming in that are not proficient in English, and we're asking them to take a reading assessment. So that definitely has an impact on how the students perform on a particular test. But I am very pleased to say I feel like our ELs have, they continue to make progress. They receive, if they're entering and merging, they receive standalone instruction, which is focused on all 4 modalities. So they're practicing listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And then on top of that, many of them also receive Orton-Gillingham to bolster their phonics skills. Yes. So we're doing the best we can to support that particular population. We've trained all of our ENL teachers, or we're in the process of training all of our ENL teachers in both Orton-Gillingham and morphology. And next year we're switching to, we're going to switch to a different program for our standalone. So we're really trying to work with that particular population of students to ensure their success.
Yeah, I'm happy that we was able to narrow those programs down so that you know, we can concentrate specifically, you know, with Orton, the program, and also doesn't have many different ones from, you know, that was throughout the district. So that was great on your behalf, you know, for seeing that. So thank you so much for your work, and I really appreciate, you know, like I said, everything that's going on here. The statistics show, you know, the value of this district, and you know how we're moving forward. And thank you again, Superintendent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Hurd. Vice President Dr. Evans Brown, any questions?
I don't have any questions, but thank you. I do want to make a comment. And thank you for your presentation. It's very thorough, and it's nice to see that there's subtle increases in proficiency, particularly among the economically disadvantaged students. Those are the ones that we are focusing in on. And the research is showing that we have to look at you know, variances when we talk about economically disadvantaged students, and the value when you show the chart that Buffalo ranks the 7th, or I think it's at the 3rd highest in proficiency among that population in Erie County. That's huge. And so the work that the teachers, the administrators, the coaches under supervision, under the superintendent's guidance is working. We're not going to see overnight successes. I've been on this board, this is my 4th year. And so now we're seeing the results of all that I ready, the, you know, all the assessments that you noted. And so kudos to, you know, all the folks who have good intentions and had a part in these subtle changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Evans Brown. Last but not least, President Belton Cottman.
Thank you. Thank you for your report. I just have 2 questions. One, when I was looking at your strategic plan on how to address this, you did not say anything about the parents. You talked about your steps and how you go about doing it, the professional development, the curriculum and resources, the data-driven instruction, et cetera, but we did, and we talked about monitoring and support, but I did not hear, are we sending homework home? Have we asked our parents to participate and move things? Could you share that with me? And the other thing is, are there any math clubs after school this year? Because I'm thinking about our Geek Squad that we have, and I'm wondering if that opportunity was expanded under our ESSER. Thank you.
So we do have the Math League, I think that's what you're referring to. And the banquets will be coming up soon. You know you're going to get your invitation. But no, I'm not sure if they're meeting after school or not. I know that many schools have the teams, and so that, you know, they've expanded grade levels as well. So they've gone down I think, to third grade at this point, because we wanted to engage as many students as possible. So those are still meeting. I can't speak to whether they're after school or not. Some of them might be, but I don't know off the top of my head. In terms of parents, actually in the targeted plan we shared with the building administrators, one of the priorities is parent engagement. So we're asking that they not only sponsor contests and things, but they keep parents in the loop. So we want to increase communication home. And I know Dr. Williams has a particular emphasis. She's going to be sending, I believe, communications to families talking about all the wonderful things that we're doing with our students. We have confidence that, especially the students they identify as part of that targeted cohort, that those students' scores will improve. And honestly, I think self-confidence of the kids will continue to grow, and we want to keep parents engaged in that. We want to make sure that they understand what the kids are learning. So a lot of that falls at the school level, but we did include it in the district plan for implementation and ask schools to implement at their own end.
So I like the idea that you have it included, but I really think that if you list it as one of your ready action steps, that it will get more attention. Okay. I really think it's really important that we put that parent engagement piece in place. And so thank you for this presentation. It was encouraging, and I don't think we lost any momentum by waiting 1 week. So thank you again. Thank you.
All right, I think that's everybody. I have one simple question and then just one comment in regards to interpreting the data. Chief Botticelli, you explained well how the cut score increases. And I think I mentioned this in November, that a lot of times we lose our attention on those that are falling into that yellow category, which are typically 1 grade level below on the iReady. And those students aren't very far off. I work with the iReady testing almost on a daily basis. I'm not as familiar with DIBELS, but there are 4 areas that go into that iReady math assessment: numbers and operations, algebra, measurement and data, and geometry. And you can be proficient in all 3 of those areas, and then 1 area you might be very low in, and then that can lower your overall score and put you in that yellow category. So for example, I'm looking at a profile right now of just as an example, and this particular example, the student is above grade level in number and operations, is 1 year below grade level in algebra, 1 year below grade level in measurement and data, and then on grade level for geometry. But their overall score is putting them a grade level below in that yellow range. So when we look at these results, I see a considerable percentage that are falling in that area that aren't very far off from being considered proficient on the math iReady.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the things in those particular domains, we look to see growth. So you're referencing the growth report?
Right.
Yeah, so the iReady has a really great growth report that we are encouraging schools to actually share with students. They set a typical growth target. So this is what the typical student, this is how much they would grow over the course of a year. This is a stretch growth target if you're behind. So it might take a student a couple years to get to grade level, but if they're meeting their stretch goals each year, that means they will eventually get there. So it won't be immediate, but they will get there if they're meeting their stretch goal. So the system is really powerful that you can show kids, look, here's where you are. If you only make typical growth, you'll stay where you are. But if you push for the stretch target, you will actually jump like 1.5 years ahead, and then in 2 years, you'll be benchmarked. So having those conversations with kids is really powerful. And to your point, you can struggle in one area and it will pull your overall score down. I like iReady a lot because it gives recommendations for instruction. So for example, the particular student you were referencing, if they were weak in geometry, there would be a recommendation for specific lessons that the teacher should do with that student to intervene. So during RTI, they group the students. The system actually groups the students for you based on their scores. And if you have maybe 3 students who are weak in geometry skills, there are recommended explicit lessons that the teacher will use with those students. So she'll pull that group of students that are sort of grouped by the system, and she'll use that very explicit lesson to intervene during RTI. So iReady does, they're called tools for instruction, and there's some great tools in there actually, both for reading and mathematics.
So my question was the end of the year results. When could we expect those?
Off the top of my head, I would assume they're in late May, early June.
Okay.
But I'd have to,
So probably a June work session?
well, probably July, but
Okay.
That would be a question for OSA, actually. But the calendar, the district calendar probably says when it's administered.
Okay. All right. Dr. Williams, any last closing comments?
If Amir is still there, I would just like to ask him to put up slide 5. I just want everybody on our platform to marinate for just a few minutes on what slide 5 visually shows. Admir? And while he's putting that up, I will just say that even if our data didn't show the progress that it does, if it showed that we were regressing, I still would not hide from it because it would be telling us a story that we've got to do some things differently. So, you know, thankfully it's showing some progress, but I really wanted you to just marinate for a few minutes on slide 5 and to, you know, think about what Chairman Scott said about those children showing up in the yellow. You know, those are children that are, I call them bubble children because they're right on the bubble. But this slide says a lot. And I know we went through things very quickly, but, you know, I'm very, very pleased with how our children are performing. You know, I won't be totally happy until we get all the way to the left, but we certainly are further to the left than we are in the middle or to the right. And it's because, you know, of the leadership that's in schools, our district leadership. I think this board focusing my work and focusing our staff's work on these goals, our teachers collectively, our parents, we have nothing to be ashamed about as far as how our children who have experienced an awful lot, all of our children have experienced a lot, but certainly our inner city children have experienced a lot over these last 3 years. And, you know, in Chief Botticelli's presentation, she talked about some national trends. This shows some Erie County trends, and we are doing fine. We are progressing. We will continue to progress. We will continue to stay the course. And I just wanted to end the night by having this visual for you to just think about and feel proud of your work too. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Well said. Chief Botticelli, thank you for the great presentation. This concludes our student achievement work session. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you. Enjoy some sunshine.
It is nice out there.
Go BPS. Ha ha.
Be blessed, everyone.
Thank you.